Hello, I'm Brad.
And I'm Jason.
You are listening to
Dice in Mind.
We won't take too long at the start because this was a real treat of an episode, truly. Um,
This was an interview with royalty.
yeah, yeah, and I think I said that I think I said it when we started the interview. Um, I played basic red box D&D as a kid a couple times, and I in effect ultimately read the material as lit. I poured over that material until it just fell apart.
Yeah.
The second book I got was the second edition Star Wars role playing game.
Yes.
I never played it because I didn't have anyone to play with. So I read through that material over and over and over, and I had notes in the book. I wish I knew it's probably still at my grandparents' house, which is now my mother's house. It's probably still in there somewhere. So when you were able to make contact with Bill Smith and he agreed to join us for an episode,
Man.
I think the only person that was probably I was excited, but you were more so.
I thought, Brad, I thought this was going to be a real long shot. I thought there's no way he's going to say yes. There's no, but we have to ask, like I said, this is RPG royalty. I still think this is one of the best games, one of the best mechanics out there.
Yeah. And so we'll keep this brief. You'll hear Bill's bio shortly. We're going to have all the notes. Any of you who have played role-playing games, who know D6 systems, are going to know who Bill is. He even says he's active out on Reddit.
Yep.
You'll see him pop up in D6 discussions and all that. And it truly was it. Jason and I were even talking about it tonight, a couple days after the interview. What a true pleasure it was to have him join us and be so giving of his time and info. Can't thank you enough, Bill, for it.
No,
and
thank you so much.
Yeah, and we want and definitely we only scratched the surface. We got to have you on because there's so much.
Yeah, we want to bring you back. The stories you shared so willingly with us for the interview, and then after we called it an interview, the time you spent with me sharing more stories. It just absolutely amazing. I'll just add, we have spent the past 4 episodes on Star Trek. And it's pretty obvious that Star Trek, certainly for me, was really impactful as a kid, still as an adult. And now we're on to like our other favorite world, which is Star Wars. And so impactful it's been. And Brad, well, and everyone knows this who's listened to us since the beginning. But as you were playing with actually, that's not true. You were playing with D&D long before I got into Star Wars. But when our good friend Scott introduced me to role-playing games, it was through Bill Smith's beautiful second edition of Star Wars, the role-playing game. And like, I had no idea that the second edition was only a year, maybe 2 old. That was it when it came out. And I didn't know anything else role-playing wise until 7 years ago. So for my life since mid-adolescence, Bill's Star Wars game was role-playing to me. You remember how reluctant, almost reticent I was initially to branch out because, well, I don't want to do those other things. Role-playing is Star Wars, is it not? Well, now I know it's broader. but it's incredible. And as you'll hear, everybody, Bill had his fingers, his imprimatur on so much. He literally sat at the table of history around Star Wars, right? This is, and he just scratched the surface with us. This was the time in the late 80s to early 90s when, as he'll say, Star Wars had kind of ceased to be a thing, because after Return of the Jedi, there really wasn't much. And then West End Games was allowed, with some convincing, to mine the Star Wars archives at Lucasfilm. And then probably many of our listeners know that when Lucasfilm started getting back into the game toward the prequels, they came to West End and asked to use some of their stuff. I mean, think about that. So not only just what Bill experienced and the access he had to be privy to all of these wonderful things, but then in a very real way, some of his writing and some of his creativity manifest still today in Star Wars canon. This is the editor and one of the writers, not merely air quotes, of the second edition source book, but of the Star Wars Game Master Handbook, which we'll talk about, and which I really do think remains the single best, most fun GM guide out there.
It just reminds me, as we go to it, that it would be cool to, and Scott, I suspect you're going to listen to this episode. So, and if you don't, then we're
we've been thinking of you, Scott, the entire way
through
on this one.
Yeah. And it just reminds me how I never got to play a full adventure with Scott, you GMing the West End D6 system. And I know you still have done it and still do it. So,
wink, nudge, nudge.
Yeah. As you listen, I got to draft you back into doing this, and that would be an interesting way for us to do some gaming again, as Brad, time permits for us.
After talking with Bill, I have wanted to get back and play.
Are you going to watch this? Are you going to resurrect Monza Ked?
Well, Monza Ked never died.
I know that, but will you resurrect the character, or will
I
you
would absolutely play the same? Yeah, maybe. I mean, he wasn't an over. He was still a younger Jedi when I left him, who had some difficult run-ins in some taverns. So I think I would. Yeah, I think I would.
I still remember. I remember your character's name. I don't know why, but for some reason, I did, and I think there was because of. I could now I know, as I just immediately think of it. Like you said, the game was role playing for you.
Yep.
And he was your character. So when we talked about role playing, that was inevitably always that character. So, and then the humorous stories that come from how just brilliantly Scott GMs.
Yeah. And all based on the wonder that is West End Games' second edition of Star Wars, the role-playing game, thanks to Bill and the others. All right, everybody, buckle up, because we are bringing you a brush with history, history that lives still today. We hope you enjoy it. Hey everybody, Jason here. Just real quickly, wanted to let you all know that we apologize in advance for some audio issues Brad and I encountered while chatting with Bill. There was an issue with connectivity on his end, so it comes and goes. We apologize for the clipping that will occur for a bit, several minutes, at least midway through the interview. Rest assured, though, it's clean at the beginning, it's clean at the end, and even with that little audio discrepancy, you're going to want to hear this. Thanks. Here we go. Bill Smith is a writer and game designer. His books have sold nearly 500,000 copies. He has written for leading publishers such as Rey Books, Little Brown, Lucasfilm, Topps, West End Games, TSR Incorporated, and Wizard Press. From 1991 to 1997, he served as the Star Wars role-playing game line editor for West End Games. In 1995, he was voted favorite designer by the RPGA, the world's largest organization for role-playing game enthusiasts. He has also written for Hershey Foods, the WIT Agency, and has been involved in motorsports promotion, marketing, and journalism for nearly 3 decades. Bill works a day job to support his writing habit and continues to publish Outlaw Galaxy stories. He hopes you enjoy them.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, got it.
All right. Well, now that we've been notified by Zoom that this is being recorded,
We are totally leaving that in. That's awesome.
This is going to be on your permanent record.
Oh, yeah. That is awesome.
Not the
Well, why
first
don't
thing,
we-
not the last.
Why don't we dive right in? So we've got Bill Smith with us, and as we talked about before the interview, I'll quote Jason, and Bill will probably a little be embarrassed. We've got RPG royalty here.
It's true.
From our perspective.
Yeah.
Because for both of us, I had just a little bit of an earlier start, very briefly when I was younger with D&D. But the first time I played with a group was, and it wasn't a long session, but was with Jason and our friend Scott playing West End Games, Star Wars role-playing game. And so we'll obviously talk about that, but I don't want to limit to that just because, Bill, I think you're a little more multifaceted than just a single role-playing game. But thanks for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Oh, thank you for having me on. I'm really excited about this. It's going to be a lot of fun. I enjoy it. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh God, thank you. Yeah, we were there's so much we'd like to talk to you about, and like Brad said, we don't want to limit it unfairly just to those early Star Wars years. What our listeners don't know is, so when we were emailing back and forth and setting this up, you then on email sent us this tome of information, and I'm like, what an incredible guy. And so I mean, I've got notes here. It's like you shared all of this history, and we really appreciate that, because it's as guys who love RPGs and love Star Wars and like love the quote unquote original Star Wars RPG, love the West End games, Star Wars, specifically the second edition, which was, as I said before we recorded, truly my entree into RPGs. And so let me just use that actually to form a question for you to get this out of the way. So when our friend Scott introduced me, this was back in my hometown, back in Wisconsin, I'd never played a role-playing game before. I mean, I knew about Dungeons and Dragons. Everyone had heard of it. Right. I think I might have played it once in junior high or 6th grade on a sleepover. And we all wanted to go to the bar, but our GM wanted us to go on the adventure. And it was like, that's it, I'm done. And so that's as far as it got. And then our friend Scott introduced me. And it was basically, he'd already had a group he'd been playing with. It must be since this came out, so they must have been doing this for a year or two, right? Okay. Sorry, they were probably going longer, because I think they started with the first edition.
I probably started with first and second were pretty compatible. So
okay, so and I never knew anything about the first other than I'd seen it on his shelf. But I bring this up because I remember those first few experiences. These guys had been playing for, like I said, must have been at least a couple of years, and they knew the rules inside and out. They welcomed me, but they never told me how anything worked. They literally just threw me into a game with a new character, and I just asked lots of stupid questions. And I bring this up because, like Brad and I on this podcast over the past year and a half already, Brad, have talked about how much we love the D20 system in general, and how much we love the narrative dice system out of Fantasy Flight Games and now Edge for different reasons.
Yeah.
That said, as a teen, I was able to be thrown into, your game. I was able to be thrown into the second edition D6 system, and over the course of just a few sessions, essentially learn the mechanic well enough to function. That to me is, without ever having read anything, I purchased the books later. That says something to me about the design, the mechanics. I wonder if you would just take a little bit and talk about your process, your intellectually creative process, in what you did to that mechanic and why you did those things.
Sure. Well, the biggest thing, of course, second edition was built on the shoulders of Greg Kostikian's design for first edition, the rules companion that was written by Greg Gordon. And even though the owner of West End Games was loath to admit it, which the Star Wars RPG is the Ghostbusters system that was designed by Chaosium for West End. The basic dice mechanic rule. Here's your attribute, you have skills, roll X number of dice, add them up, aim for a difficulty number. That was the Ghostbusters system. And then Greg Kostikian adapted and modified that system very extensively to suit the Star Wars universe, much more technically oriented kind of universe. And their goal was to write a game that could be very easily played and run for people who had never played a game before. Their thinking was, yes, we're going to get tons of people who've played Dungeons and Dragons, because that is the entry point for almost everybody in the industry at that time. Yeah. But at the same time, West End Games had distribution through one of the few companies that had solid distribution through B. Dalton and Walden Books. Right. So we had access to not just the game stores, but the mainstream bookstores. So they were shooting for a game that somebody could pick up, because Star Wars, the game came out in 87, so it was 4 years after Return of the Jedi. And at that time, a lot of the conventional wisdom that, Star Wars, it was kind of cool, but had really been nothing new for a few years. And without the internet to prove how large the fandom is, it was very easy for a lot of people in mainstream publishing to dismiss the idea. But they knew that this is the biggest movie series in history. So Greg and the West End team, which included, Bill Slavicsek and Curtis Smith, who co-wrote the Star Wars source book, and tons of other very talented designers and playtesters, they designed a game that would be accessible to people who were new to role-playing games. And when I went and did the second edition, my primary thing was, what happened is the original press run of first edition had gone out of print. They had released the Rules Companion about 1.5 to 2 years after the original game came out. I remember picking it up in the fall of, I can't remember if it was 88 or 89. So it was 1 or 2 years after the original Star Wars RPG came out. Management said, we can just reprint the book, but then we tell people, but you have to go out and buy this Rules Companion anyway. Can we do one game book? And it was like, sure. And he's like, what? And Rich Horan, who was the he was the president of he was the vice president of West End Games. He was basically the great guy. I love Rich, awesome guy, fun storyteller. Wasn't much of a gamer, but loved Star Wars, particularly loved Star Wars. Sure. And the owner of the company, Scott Palter, he was not as directly involved because he was busy running the other family business as well. So Rich was really the day-to-day operations guy. And Rich said, are there any other things that you want to adjust in the game system or change, or, and I viewed my job as to kind of put everything together in a consistent way and try to address some of the play balance issues that other designers had mentioned to me, that gamers had mentioned to me through letters or meeting people at Gen Con and things like that. And so it was one of those things where, when you're young and you don't know what you can't do for better or worse. And I kind of dove in, and I had a good handle on what some of the issues were. The solutions I came up with them, I will readily admit, probably weren't the most elegant. I think revised and expanded, which we did about 4 or 5 years later in 95 or 96, was where I really got to go back and like, it was the director's cut of the game, and go back and really smooth things out. There were, a couple of core mechanical things. Like one of the big problems with the basic game system, if you had, say, 5 dice in a skill and you were in a conflict with somebody who had 6 dice in a skill, 75% of the time they were going to beat you.
Yep.
There's just, you'd have to spend a force point. So I copied the ghost die mechanic from Ghostbusters because it was there and it worked, and introduced the wild die. And I also gave players the option of, they got experience points after every adventure. That was always there in the game all along. And I said, well, now you have the option of when you really need to, you can spend an experience point, which we renamed character points, to roll an extra die. So between the wild die, the variabilities of the wild die, because they went both ways for NPCs and PCs, and giving the players that option, that smoothed out a lot of the hey, we just can't do this scenarios that you'd run into as a player. And we introduced the command skill. There was a rule in first edition about players working together, and we basically revised the command skill to that. Okay, this is how you guys work together, because the rules companion had a capital ship combat system, which people desperately wanted. They wanted to do Star Destroyers against the Rebel fleet. And the mechanics were really complicated. It was in the rules companion. It was just challenging. It was really, I never was able to successfully wrap my mind around it. And so I tried to slim it down so that you could use the command skill for everything of, we've got 3 people trying to fix the hyperdrive all at once, to, hey, let's, have the Star Destroyer turn that bank of turbo lasers against that ship on the Rebel fleet. So you'd roll your command skill, and if you rolled well enough, you could coordinate this many number of people and get a bonus to that roll, which you add to the highest skilled person roll. Wow. So, there were a couple of, so really second edition was more or less putting together what was already there. I did a couple of those rules things. Yeah. I did add a ton of skills. So the original Star Wars game system had, I think, 16 or 17 skills between the 6 attributes. It was probably more than that, actually. It's probably about 25 skills now that I'm visualizing the character sheet and realizing, no, it's more than that. So probably about 25 skills. But the thing I got hung up on, and this was a me thing, this was something that I heard from some players and other people didn't care, was flying the Millennium Falcon is completely different than flying an X-Wing or flying a Star Destroyer. So I split things up into, there's space transports for flying freighters, there's starfighter piloting, there's capital ship piloting. In retrospect, I really wish I'd never done that. Because, why? Well, it made it where a character players felt like they had to invest their characters in a ton of different skills. And it gobbled up experience points. And it seemed like, there were some people who loved that split. There were a lot of people who just wish we'd stayed simpler and more cinematic and more streamlined.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's weird, because when Star Wars came out, it was considered such a lightweight game system that a lot of designers, a lot of other companies, from what I gathered, considered it almost not a game because it was so lightweight. Of course, these days, D6 is the way. They're really crunchy. But back then, I mean, the other games out there were D&D, Shadowrun. Those were the big Battletech.
Oh God.
ICE system, the Lord of the Rings game, and Rollmaster, Chaosium stuff, Pendragon, and Call of Cthulhu, and RuneQuest, GURPS. GURPS. So Champions, let's not forget Champions. So by comparison to most of the other industry, D6 was one of the most lightweight games out there, with the exception of Toon. And so it was considered really, now these days, D6 is considered really kind of crunchy. But back then, and so I was trying to do some things that would appeal to more of the traditional gaming audience, and give them a little bit more detail to chew on, with skills split up. But ultimately, as I always explain to people, is like, there are a lot of things here you can use, but ultimately the core game system is very simple. You have attributes and skills that tells you how many dice to roll. Roll your dice. You pick a difficulty number, and there are these guidelines. Very easy is 0 to 5. Easy is 6 to 10. That sort of thing. Heroic is 31 plus. You've got those guided ranges. But the bottom line is roll your dice. High is good. Low is bad. Go. Have fun with it. Make something that's fun and cinematic. I was just checking the Reddit D6 board, and they were talking about, the space transports repair rules say that it takes 15 minutes to repair my hyperdrive. Well, what if the guys are in a battle? It's going to take 180 turns. And I was glad to see a bunch of people like, don't do that. Go on, give them a couple of skill tasks that they can roll against to temporarily repair the ship, and let them do that so they can escape.
Nice.
So that they can escape, and give them something exciting and dramatic they can do. And naturally, because they've only repaired it in the most temporary, haphazard, jury-rigged kind of way, they have very little control over where they're jumping, and naturally they're going to jump to the worst possible place and have to figure out, now what do we do? And that's the essence. To me, that was the essence of the Star Wars game, is let's make something dramatic and exciting and fun, and, high is good, low is bad, judge accordingly, have fun. Make it cinematic, make it adventure-oriented.
How does it, so you, like you said, you were just out on D6 Reddit boards. So, obviously West End, you worked with them until 97, if I remember correctly.
Yes. I left in 97.
So years later, just a couple, because we're all relatively the same age, and yesterday was just yesterday. But I graduated from high school in 86. It was 2 weeks ago. Okay, yeah. For us, then it means it was a week ago. Because we were right behind you.
Maybe more like a few days, but keep going.
Yeah, but you're still seeing people play this, and you're still seeing this really cool community debate this stuff a few years, obviously, after you worked on this. Gotta be cool to see.
Yeah, it's very I'll tell you what, my heart really does swell every time. It just makes me feel good every time I see somebody say, whenever they say nice things about the West End system, and you see those threads come up a lot on the various RPG subreddit. Reddit's like my social. I don't do Facebook. I'm a Reddit guy. And you see a lot on the RPG boards. Sometimes Star Wars EU, sometimes the D6 system, the D6 Star Wars subreddit isn't super busy, but Star Wars D6 does get mentioned when people talk about the various options for the Star Wars role-playing game. And it really, I'm glad people enjoy it, because I loved working on it. I was a fan first and a designer second.
Right.
And every project that, whether or not I succeeded at what I set out to do, whenever I worked on a game product for West End, I wanted that product to be the kind of thing where I, as a Star Wars fan, would be like, this is so cool. And I tried to bring that energy and enthusiasm. Like if you ever read any of my fiction that I write, I don't think I'm necessarily the best technical fiction writer, but I think I bring a lot of genuine enthusiasm to my work, and I hope that readers will forgive my weaknesses, because they can tell that the person that's telling the story is 125% into it, or 1,000% into it, and let's have fun with this. And I tried to bring that to the game products, because I was a huge Star Wars fan. And I had all the Marvel, not all the Marvel comics. I had all the Marvel comics I could get my hands on.
Yeah.
I had the daily novels, the Splinter of the Mind's Eye, the Lando Calrissian novels, which was really all there was until West End came out. And then of course in 91 when I started, then Bantam started releasing the novels slowly at first, but then as they realized, hey, there's a real audience for this, they ramped up. Dark Horse got the comics going. You had the X-Wing and TIE Fighter computer games. And, you know, I met so many of the people that I worked with, that I met through these various projects. They were just as big a fan as I was. There were, you know, Tim Zahn and Mike Stackpole, who are guys who I love hanging out with them. I love talking to them. Awesome guys. And they made it clear that they loved Star Wars as much as all of us did. And, you know, and I think they brought that I'm a fan first, and I'm going to try and do the kinds of things that I want to see. And I tried to bring that sense of enthusiasm to my books. You know, some were more successful than others. You know how that works out. But I really loved what I did, and I'm really glad that people still enjoy those products. You know, and you know, all the different games, they all scratch different itches for people. And some people want to do the more contemporary thing, or I haven't played the FFG game, but I've heard great. My brother has run group with it. He loves it. Just absolutely loves it. And, you know, of course, it's the contemporary game, and you know, and I understand they're just hitting it out of the park with their products, which is awesome, you know.
So, but I promise we're going to go to your fiction because we really want to talk more about that.
Well,
but before we do, because of something you just said, so with the writing and being the fan first, and clearly the enthusiasm coming through, I think the single best GM guide ever written is the Game Master Handbook for Star Wars West End. I didn't even encounter it somehow until just literally a few years ago, after Brad and I had been sporadically playing Edge of the Empire, right from FFG. But while I was GMing a little bit for that, I wanted some more guidance. And I thought, okay, I remembered, I mean, again, I've got my copy right here. I remembered how wonderful, and like you said, truly cinematic second edition of the WG book was. I mean, it really saying, and I thought, okay, I'm going to pick up this used copy because they're still floating around online of the Game Master Handbook. And you were editor on that, correct?
Yes. That was actually, the product was my idea, and we recruited a bunch of freelancers to work on it, and I worked on some of it, and a lot of them were staffers, so we could all work together pretty tightly. But as a gamer, the most interesting part of any game to me is the Game Master guidance.
Yeah.
You know, for me, I played games because I really wasn't much of a gamer. I was more of I want to experience cool worlds guy.
Yep.
And I was always, gaming appealed to me because fiction can be so la 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 la. And I'm like, well, let's get to the cool stuff. And so I loved the idea of exploring a world, creating an imaginary but internally consistent world that's an amazing place to adventure. And I wanted the Game Master Handbook to be that kind of thing of, here are some of the tricks and tips we've done to try and make our Star Wars games cool. And great, you know, the West End staffers, we were all, you don't go work at a job like that just because it's a job. You do it because it's a labor of love. Because if you don't love it, you're just not gonna make it. You're gonna burn out. But if you love what you do, I was thinking about that. The second edition game, 30th anniversary will be next month of the release date.
Wow.
And that kind of hit me because I remember how much of a struggle it was, and how overwhelmed by the deadlines and the pressure, and I felt terrible about what I was doing to the rest of the staff, because it's like, Bill, we need this book. I'm like, I'm working on it. And at the same time, I wanted it to be the best that it could be. And it was 30 years ago, and I was just this young kid, just like, I just want to do this cool thing. I hope I can make it cool. It's like, let's roll the dice and hope things come together. But I worked with such incredibly talented people. It was an awesome experience.
So, I mean, okay, so you joined West End in 91. So how old were you at the time?
I joined in January 91, and I was 21 years old. I had just graduated from high school or from college in May of 1990.
So how did you land? I mean, that's remarkable. How did you land there? I mean, how did that work?
So I got my degree in communications from a small school, College of St. Rose in Albany, New York, small college. I was editor of the student newspaper there, which, it's funny because I almost went to SI Newhouse in Syracuse because they've got an incredible journalism program.
Yep.
But I felt more comfortable going to a smaller, more personal school. And the fact of the matter is, I never would have gotten a shot to be editor at a much larger school. It was kind of like you're interested, and there's not a huge pool of people to choose from. So I was editor of a student newspaper, and then that got me a job as an assistant editor for a trade magazine that was based in the Capital District, right outside of Albany. It was for cleaning and industrial supplies. There was a trade magazine publisher there, and I was excited to be working in print. I had been announcing stock car races and doing public relations, writing press releases, news reports, and promotional pieces for racetracks since I was in high school because I love the sport. I've always said, as a kid, my life was about Star Wars and stock cars, and they were the things that I loved passionately. Yeah. So I had those kind of credentials. And the funny thing is, so West End had this thing, and it's standard, where if you want to submit anything, you have to get a release, you have to sign a release, because, and most publishers, they don't want to be at risk of getting sued. You stole my idea. Yeah. So you have to sign a release. So I, in the fall of 1990, Torg, which was West End's big game, their new game system, which I loved. I was a huge Torg fan. So I didn't bother with writing for the author's guidelines. I just wrote up a proposal for a book. Hey, I'd like to do this game master guide for Torg, and I mailed it into West End Games. And I got a call from Rich Rerun, who was the vice president of West End, about 2 weeks later. This was right just before Christmas, and he's like, "This proposal you sent in," and I'm like, "Yeah," and he's like, "Okay, you're never supposed to send in anything without a release. We technically can't look at it. That said, do you want to come down for a job interview?" Because of course, in the proposal, I said, hey, I would love to come work at West End. Yeah. And it was only about 3 hours away from me. It was really the only game company on the East Coast. So it was only about 3 hours from where I was in Albany. And I'm like, do you need me there today? I can leave my job. It's okay. And so they interviewed me, and I didn't realize they wanted me to do the Star Wars stuff, but they came down and interviewed. And the nice thing is, Honesdale, very small town in northeastern Pennsylvania, very rim. I grew up in a very, very small town in the northern Adirondacks. So we're not in Canada, but we can see it from here. I'm an hour from Montreal. And so one of the big issues that they had with recruiting talent is, because West End used to be located in New York City, is are you willing to move to Honesdale, Pennsylvania? Because it's this really small town where if you don't like to go hunting and fishing, there's not a lot of things to do here. Right. And I'm like, I grew up in a town just like this. I get it. And and so they gave me a shot. They said, they hired me as an editor, and I was like, this is my dream job, and it was, and I just, I didn't have much of a work-life balance at the time. I spent a ton of time just working. Wouldn't change a thing. I loved what I did. Still love what I did. I miss it every day, even though the deadline pressures and things like freelancers flaking out.
Yeah.
So we have to write a book in 2 weeks.
My God,
drove me nuts. But
Yeah.
man, I miss that place. I miss the job. I loved what I did.
But it's not like you've been dormant since then. You've written quite a bit.
I've written a few after I left West End in '96. I've written a few novels. I've released 2 novels and 2 short story collections and done this scattered freelance thing. I've got a ton of short stories and like 5 or 6 novels they're like in first and a half draft stage. And I'm one of those people that I tend to do a good 3 or 4 drafts. And my schedule is so busy that when I get time, I want to do something fresh, So, but I do have a ton of stuff that when I get a little bit more time, I want to finish it. And, my goal is to, of course, with indie publishing these days, when I started at West End, the only option was traditional publishing. And for the most part, you could only sell 1 or 2 books a year unless you used a ton of pen names because they would only publish 1 or 2 books a year. Well, these days with indie publishing, there are a lot of authors who write a book every month or 2, and they make some of them make a great living doing it. The ones who are prolific and consistent, who learn the marketing and advertising elements. There's a lot to it, but I want to be that guy, but right now I work, I joke, I work a day job to support my writing habit, and to make sure that we keep a roof over the head. And to quote Mal from Firefly, my son has a powerful need to eat. So,
yes.
So I do, but it's funny. I don't get to do as much creative stuff as I want to, but I have to admit, I'm in a really good place with my life. So, but I still love writing. I don't get to write as much as I want to, but I'm pretty satisfied with a lot of things. I like what I do. I like the people I work with. I drive school bus. I love the kids. My son's a great little guy. My wife's awesome. I'm pretty happy with it. And it's funny.
That's awesome.
Like I said, if somebody had told me when I was in high school, yeah, you'll be back in your hometown. Like, and you'll be happy. And I would have been like, no way.
I come from a hometown, not totally unlike yours. I hear you.
Yeah. It's worked out well. I joke with my wife, because my dream was to work at West End and go work at Lucasfilm, which I think I wanted to take the path that Pablo Hidalgo has taken, and went to work, and I really wanted to do that. In retrospect, I probably wouldn't have been the best fit at Lucasfilm because I was more interested in creating cool stuff. And when you're at Lucasfilm, a lot of it's more administrative because you're managing the projects and I don't and I think I kind of I used to joke at West End. It's like okay, give me a deadline. Now go away, and in a month, that manuscript will be done. And one of the things that was one of the hardest things for me at West End is I had to leave at 5 o'clock. They locked up the building, go home, and I'm like, it's half-hour drive. By the time I get home and eat dinner and I'm out of writer mode. And well, you can come in early. I'm like, dude, I'm 21 years old. I'm not coming into work at 6 in the morning. Now I have to wake up at 4 in the morning to go drive school bus. But then that was a non-starter. But I remember this. It's coming up. My wife and I were just getting married. I had a project that was that needed to be done before we left, and I was like, Rich, can I just stay like 3 or 4 hours? I just want to finish this before I go. And I edited that whole book in 4 hours. I finished that book in 4 hours because nobody was in my office. Because we didn't have offices with doors. We had cubes. Well, not cubes, but they were. It was like an open air design. So it was you could only manage your time as well as your coworkers let you. And that was a challenging thing, because most of the guys I worked with were awesome, but a few of them like to come in and chat, and I'm like, you can talk at me, but I'm still typing, But it's and that was one of those things. If they had let me, work till 11 o'clock at night, I probably would have done that a lot. Just because I loved what I was doing.
See, that is cool.
Yeah,
that's hard to find, and to be able to find that at 21.
Oh my God!
But it wasn't a job. It was a passion for me.
Right.
Go ahead.
No, I was go ahead, because I was going to ask about something else, but I don't want to do that quite yet.
But no, I mean, that's what I did for fun. It's like, and to this day, what do I do for fun? I pull out a pen and a notebook and I start writing some dialogue, or writing a scene in a story, and that's what because it's it's funny, because they talk about athletes getting into the zone, and writing for me is I go into that altered state of almost hypnosis, that altered state of consciousness, where I get so very deeply immersed, and it is deeply, deeply relaxing for me. So it's very therapeutic when I get to write. And I just love it. And, it's funny, because invariably when I write something, I'll read the finished product and it's like, that's not exactly what I set out to do. But sometimes I'm like, I still really like this, and because it's an exploratory phenomenon. I'm an outliner, but I still have in my mind the feeling I'm going for. And a lot of times the feeling is not exact. I told the story that I outlined on paper, but the feeling isn't exactly the same. But sometimes, even though it's not the same as what I was shooting for, I was like, I think the story still works, and that's always fun. So it is something that for me, it's as much as an exploration as it is creating something, even though I'm a pretty rigid outliner.
When you also had mentioned too, because I want to talk about like Outlaw Galaxy, because I know you have that out. But before you do that, you had also mentioned that you had worked in radio too.
Yes.
Yeah.
What did you do?
So I was in high school, and my speech and debate. So I did speech and debate in high school, and my speech and debate teacher got me doing a job DJing on Saturday nights, and so I DJ, spun records, took requests, the standard radio stuff. And after about 3 weeks, I got the offer to announce stock car races at the local track over in Plattsburgh, New York, and I'm like, and I had to go talk to my teachers, like, I know you went and got me this job, but I really want to announce stock car racing because that's fun. and so I left DJing right after that, but I did my internship in college at the local public radio station in Albany. Worked for a great news director named Don Decker. He was a legend in Capital District Radio. And over the years, I've done a ton of radio hosting, like most local racetracks have a weekly radio show of some sort where they, do recaps and driver interviews and, the Sunday promo stuff. And so I do a lot of that kind of thing where I do driver interviews, take phone calls, and do a combination of pre-recorded and live stuff, and ton of fun. I enjoyed doing it. I got out of it just because just too much time, especially with my little guy. It's just like, he's only going to be a little guy once. So, I still love the sport, but he's only going to be a little guy once. So
that's really
and
cool.
You'll have time as he grows too, maybe to get back into some of that too.
Yeah.
But like you said, they're only young once, right?
Yeah. If he's a fan, I'm sure I'll get back into it. But right now, everything in my wife's and I lives are is like, what would Billy enjoy doing? And
really sweet.
That's where we are. But
wow. So tell us about Outlaw Galaxy.
Oh, okay. So when I was just after I'd left West End, I was working on the Essential Guide to Weapons and Technology. And for the original one, that was the black cover version that came out 25 years ago. I left West End. And it was one of those, like, I've got to finish this book. And there was no way I could juggle a day job in getting that. But as it was really over deadline. I was like, I've got to do this book no matter what. And then I'll figure out what I'm doing, you know?
Yep.
So as I was wrapping up that book, I kind of started noodling around that, you know, I wanted to experiment with fiction. And so I just started, I knew what kind of, I definitely took creating the Outlaw Galaxy series in the same way that a game designer would, as opposed to a traditional fiction writer. I built the world first, wanted to build a universe that was internally consistent,
Right.
and then started, hey, what kind of stories do I want to tell? And the first story, first Outlaw Galaxy book, Trip and the Space Pirates, is thematically and emotionally essentially Treasure Island in space kind of feel.
Okay.
It's, you know, a young man gets captured by space pirates. So part of it is I wanted to do young adult fiction. I had read a couple, I had only read the Heinlein Juvies. I had only started reading them in the mid 90s after I was at West End, because it never occurred to me to write for them. I didn't particularly look for them. Nobody ever recommended them to me. But, you know, I started reading the Heinlein Juvies about 94, 95. And I was like, these are awesome. How come nobody's writing more books like this? So I wanted to do a young adult series. I wanted, the way I described it is, you know, my fiction is always going to be suitable for readers of all ages, family friendly. So I'm not afraid of tackling something that's controversial, but you can still handle something that's controversial in a delicate manner, in a polite way. So, you know, the content in my books is very light PG. It's action. It's very similar to the original Star Wars movie. I mean, that was my first love. And I kind of copied that tonal guideline in the sense of it's, you know, no swearing, no adult content, no graphic violence. And so that I could with full faith, hand this to somebody and say, you can give this to your kid. And
sci-fi as it should
you might
be.
want to check it out. You might enjoy it, you know?
Yep. Beautiful.
Because I try to write it so that it's fun for an older, you know, for an adult to read, but that a kid with a decent vocabulary is, you know, that no parent is going to find something where they're like, oh, I can't believe they put that in there. And that's actually kind of a big issue in even young adult publishing.
It is.
You know, what editors will allow into those books is very different now than it was a few years ago, and they've really pushed the boundaries a lot. And I am, my choice is that I'm not going to go in that sort of direction with my books. I'm not necessarily opposed to it. I'm not passing judgment on having more adult content in young adult books. Yeah, we live in a different world than when I, you know, first started writing my books. But I'm not going to, you know, I've got my own guidelines that I follow. You know, the basic setting is it's similar to traditional space opera. It follows in the tradition of Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, Babylon 5, original Star Trek, Star Wars. It's a you know, universe with, you know, hyperspace drives, although not super fast. Like rule of thumb is you might only be able to reach a handful of different systems in a day's travel.
Right.
I stole something from Traveler. There's no faster than light communication. And the reason why, so you have to, and the reason why I did that is so then you have to go there as opposed to just pick up the space telephone and call. So which is something that was largely in the original Star Wars role-playing game, with the exception of the HoloNet, which the Empire controlled. There wasn't really a lot of faster than light communication.
Nope.
And we leaned into that at West End, that concept at West End, because you have to go there then. You have to go find these things out. A lot of times you're jumping in, you have no idea what's going on. And that's a great adventure hook. And so I kind of copied that idea. My universe is very balkanized, in that there's thousands and thousands and thousands of different governments. You know, if there's a government that controls 10, 15, 20 systems, that's a big deal. Most systems are so and because my hyperdrives are relatively slow, and I use the term hyperdrive because I can do the hand wavy easily enough. And because there's no faster than light communication, hey, what's on the other side of the galaxy? Yeah, we don't know. It's going to take us to get there, and there's flows of energy and things like that. So you couldn't make a continuous jump. You need to have the charts to get through the hyperspace currents safely, and those are all elements of classic space opera.
Right.
It's not. I'll readily admit it's not original. I'm drawing on stuff that's been around for nearly 100 years at this point.
Yeah.
But it's a great recipe for fun adventure. And really cool. So I wanted to design. The thinking in the back of my mind is, if I'm going to start writing fiction, I'm going to write fiction until I can't write anymore. So I want to create a setting where I will be happy playing in that setting for 50 years.
Now, let's just hypothetically say that there were a couple middle-aged guys who are fans of your Star Wars RPG work. Would someone like that specific but general demographic enjoy reading these books, even though they might be targeted for YA?
I sure hope so. I try to write my books so that they're not. One of the problems with a lot of YA authors is they talk down to their audience.
Right.
And the thing I loved about Heinlein's Juvies is I picked them up as a guy in my 20s and was like, these are awesome.
Nice.
And I tried to maintain that kind of, this is a fun adventure that, yes, it stars a young, inexperienced protagonist, but I wanted to, the first couple of novels do. My short stories cover a lot more different territories. So even though the first couple of books start off as YA, the more I've written, the more it's become, this is a setting, kind of like Dungeons and Dragons and Forgotten Realms, that, the Forgotten Realms books or the Dragonlance books are a setting. And there are 1,000,001 different kinds of stories and different groups of characters whose adventures we're going to follow, but they all exist in a consistent universe. And that's the kind of feel I'm going for. And definitely I'm trying to write my stories so that people of all ages will enjoy them. I'm trying to write things that I'm not going to get bored with. How successful I am, the readers are going to have to judge that, but that's what I'm shooting for.
Yeah.
So
I love the idea because like you said early on, you built the world, you built the universe.
Yeah, love that.
And then you started telling, it's like, because Jason and I talk about world building in the context
all
of RPGs all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not a writer, but I've been working on something for Jason and I to game in, and I built that environment. Like you said, I was, Dragonlance was one example of it.
Mm-hmm.
So hearing you talk about that's just, very kindred idea, although I'm much more amateur than you are at doing this. So nothing of mine is publishable, but just that idea.
The world building gets us going every time.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I could go off on a tangent on it.
As gamers, I think it's in our DNA because we want to, how does this world work? In the gimme, the buy-in is the implicit belief that this is a realistic, consistent world that we are adventuring in, and that we're here to see and do all the cool things and meet all the cool people and find these and blame Tolkien, but there are that's, I think, as gamers we want a story that stands up more than this was just a good idea at the time, and that was one of the things that poor George Lucas, we hung on his every word when we were elaborating on things with the West End stuff, because if there was a line in that movie, we had to assume, okay, this is the reality of that universe. What are the implications of that? And that was one of the things where I always was kind of an EU guy, and so I have to say that the new Star Wars movies are not necessarily written with me in mind, because I'm like, you can't fly a spaceship into an atmosphere. You can't jump from a standing start. You can't hyperspace skip, because look at all the trouble Han Solo had getting out of Tatooine. You've created a universe where you don't need starships anymore, because you can just jump from inside an atmosphere to the next planet. And yeah, it's hard. No, don't try. Well, we can only do it this once. It's like, I'm a race car fan. And no matter how good a mechanic is, you can't build an Indy car that goes 500 miles an hour. Right. It just doesn't, the universe doesn't work that way. The technology isn't there the way it's been explained to us. So now there wasn't even that pretense of, oh, everything's different now.
Yeah.
And part of it is, for me, I don't necessarily want the universe to change. I fell in love with that universe. And I understand there's evolution to things, but so part of it is me being old and stodgy and set in my ways,
I'm curious though, if I may. I think we both hear you. I mean, we enjoy it, but I think we both hear you loud and clear regarding the sequels. I'm curious though, as a writer, as a storyteller, what do you think about some of the? I mean, again, we're of an age. All these miniseries, right? I'm curious what you think about Mandalorian's not, because that's ongoing. But what do you think about the storytelling in the world with, like Mandalorian, Obi-Wan, etc.? Like Andor's about to drop, right? What do you think of those?
I think it's awesome. I think the thing is, I as a concept, you can tell Star Wars to me is just like a novel. I think having a miniseries is where whether you deal with established characters or new characters, but you can tell a great story. And one of the things that I've always felt were Star Wars, where when I worked on the role-playing stuff, my job was not to try and outdo the movies. Because the reason why those movies are the movies is because they are the biggest, most important stories in that universe. My job is to tell a smaller scale story that can have great personal stakes for those characters, but we're not necessarily going to change the fate of the galaxy.
Right.
And the miniseries have this wonderful potential to tell these amazing stories within this universe. You don't have to be disruptive. You can tell the small, very personal tale very well in those. And of course, the execution of each, it's going to depend on the creative team. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I think Lucasfilm would be well advised to write Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau a blank check and say, go do whatever you want. Because I think they get it. I think they get what makes the universe work.
Yep.
To a large, I really, really trust them for the most part. And I know like Book of Boba Fett got a lot of criticism for not being a complete tale. And my favorite TV show of all time is Babylon 5. And if I've ever heard anything about Babylon 5, everybody's like, season 1 sucks. No, season 1 is prelude. Season 1 is we're going to put all the pieces on the table so that when we start knocking pieces off the table in season 2, it'll mean something to you. And I'm hoping that Book of Boba Fett is prelude to, so I don't look at it as a standalone. I look at it as chapter 1.
Yeah.
I hope. And I hope they do some really cool things with chapter 2, chapter 3, that sort of, I'm hoping that's how it works out. I'm sure they're itching to do some of those kinds of things. And I mean, let's face it, Boba Fett was done wrong in Return of the Jedi. And Boba Fett, I was a Boba Fett fanboy. Like Boba Fett was the guy I wanted to know more about.
Yes. Yep.
And so I'm along for the ride, crossing my fingers, hoping for the best, because I want Boba Fett to still be the meanest, scariest guy in the galaxy after Vader and the Emperor. Yes. And what I remember joking with Steve Sansweet at Lucasfilm, I was like, I was not a big fan of the Ewoks, just not my and he's like, well, I'm like, and he was defending the Ewoks, like, well, what's wrong with having a a thing in the galaxy where, a race that's pure and honest. It's like, and they eat stormtroopers, was my follow-up. But the one thing that was really missing in Return of the Jedi is, Han's leading the rebels and Boba Fett shows up. And, and they have, granted, it would have been bloated and it would have not contributed anything dramatically to the story, but it would have been really cool. And a good follow-up would have been Sean Connery showing up and shooting Boba Fett and saying, "Son, why do I always have to save you?"
Oh my God.
And I'm like, yeah, it would have been corny, but if you did it right, it really could have worked.
I mean, Star Wars, the original trilogy kind of mastered the corny, but it really works.
Well, and I was thinking about this. The as a kid, what worked for me with Star Wars is that it was the movie took itself seriously. The universe took itself seriously.
Yeah.
And the humor came from the sarcasm of the characters, that kind of grimdark humor of, we're gonna die. We should at least, and I think one of the things that some creators have struggled with is, and even George Lucas, when he was talking about Phantom Menace and when he was doing the special editions, he's like, well, it's a kid's movie. And it's like, no, it really, it needs to me, Star Wars can be some very sophisticated storytelling that can appeal to audiences of all ages.
Yeah.
And there's a great quote from Kevin Smith: "Trust the audience; they'll come along." And I'm paraphrasing it inaccurately, I know, but you can tell a really interesting story, and if you engage the audience, they will come along with you. And you don't need to do the slapstick, you don't need to do the goofy humor. The funny part of the original Star Wars was Han Solo's wisecracking. And he was a sarcastic and kind of bitter guy until they did the special edition where they softened things. I'm a Han shot first guy
without question.
I'm a Jabba would have done something more than squeal when Han stepped on his tail kind of guy. I thought those sometimes you don't need to go for the obvious laugh. Sometimes the humor can be a little bit more subtle, and humor can lose all your dramatic tension if it's not executed properly. So and that's and I'll admit, when we did the West End stuff, some of our stuff was admittedly a little goofy, just as with the comics and novels, and but I tended to be on the more serious Star Wars side. That's just my taste,
Bill, we could keep you forever. You've been so gracious with your time. Thank you so much for doing this evening.
We've only touched the surface, so we have.
Oh my God,
it's
been so fascinating. We would love to have you back.
Sure, anytime.